Back in September 2020, President Xi Jinping of China made a statement that kind of took other world leaders by surprise. He announced that his country would reach what he called peak carbon emissions by 2030 and then go on to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2060. China's not known for making grand declarations about these sorts of things unless they're very sure they can deliver. So this latest announcement has been received cautiously but positively by the international community. And it's fair to say that China has got many reasons why getting to net zero as fast as possible is in their interest. Not only will it alleviate the crippling air pollution suffered by hundreds of millions of people in its largest cities, and which currently causes an estimated 2.4 million premature deaths every single year, but it'll also have a massive influence on mitigating the worst effects of climate change, much of which will be felt as severely, if not more so, by China than anywhere else. Just last year, for example, the most expensive climate-driven weather event anywhere in the world was the relentless monsoon flooding across many Chinese provinces during the summer. Millions of people's livelihoods were adversely affected and hundreds died. Croplands were destroyed, infrastructure was damaged, and the whole thing cost an estimated $17 billion. Last year as well, China installed the equivalent of 3 large wind turbines and 5 football fields worth of solar panels every hour. But they also added the equivalent of 1 large coal plant to their grid each week as well. So what's going on? Is China really genuine in this pledge, and can they really achieve what they say they will? And even if they do, is their timeline fast enough to stay in line with the Paris emissions reductions targets? Hello and welcome to Just Have a Think. In April 2021, 2 research papers were published, both scrutinising President Xi's plan. The first came from a group of economic, environment and climate experts from various well-respected institutions in several countries, including China and the US and Germany, headed up by lead author Dr. Hongbu Duan, Associate Professor at the University of Chinese Academy of Sciences. It was published in the online Science magazine, and its overall conclusion was that China's 2060 pledge was broadly in line with the 1.5 degrees Celsius target set out in the Paris Agreement, but with a whole bunch of caveats that we'll take a look at in a moment. The second report comes from a UK-based organisation called Transition Zero, set up in November 2020 by a group of analysts who spent many years working together on the Carbon Tracker initiative, a programme that aims to help markets and corporations understand and quantify the risks that climate change poses to them and their shareholders if they don't take the appropriate rapid actions. You may have heard of China's famous 5-year plans. The first one was put in place by Mao Zedong way back in 1953. In March of 2021, China announced details of the 14th of these plans. It pledged that energy consumption and carbon emissions per unit of gross domestic product, or GDP, will decline by 13.5% and 18% respectively by 2025. The plan includes impressive targets for wind and solar installations, but it also contains phrases like promoting the clean use of coal. According to the Transition Zero report, the 2 activities of rapid growth in renewables and the continuation of new coal capacity are mutually incompatible and are leading to unsustainable and unnecessary overcapacity in the Chinese energy market. In 2020, an estimated 31 gigawatts of net coal capacity came online in China. Another 37 gigawatts was granted construction approval, and 74 gigawatts worth was given planning approval. That's an estimated total investment of $112 billion in power generation that will enter an already oversupplied market. The average capacity factor of China's coal fleet has declined from 57% in 2010 to 49% in 2020. In other words, those coal-fired plants are only producing half their potential maximum and far less than they should be doing in order to justify their capital and running costs. If all the currently planned new coal capacity up to 2030 is actually built and commissioned, then the Transition Zero research predicts that the operating capacity factor will drop down to 32%, less than a third of maximum power generation potential. And that's assuming a growth in energy demand of 4% per year. But even at a higher growth of 6% a year, the capacity factor still drops significantly. Meanwhile, the analysis carried out by Dr. Duan and his team found that for China to stay in line with the 1.5 degrees goal, its power sector would need to phase out coal completely by 2050 and reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 66% over the coming decade. That means that coal would need to be substantially replaced by renewables during that time window. So why would China actively build out more coal plants that are being rendered more and more expensive and less useful by China's own renewable energy program? Well, the Transition Zero report points out that although China may look to us in the West like a complete autocracy dominated by one man and his ever-obedient entourage, there are in fact quite complicated power dynamics bubbling away between Xi Jinping's central government and state-owned enterprises and local governments. Some of those local government and industry decision makers appear to be acting against President Xi's net zero plans. The report highlights the northern province of Inner Mongolia, where just last year electricity and industrial facilities were locally approved with an estimated energy demand equivalent to 80 million tonnes of coal every year. And that's equivalent to the total coal demand of Germany. Coal-driven electricity projects in the provinces of Henan, Inner Mongolia, Jiangsu and Shandong make up a third of China's total capacity. But these new local investments look like yet another example of willful ignorance and blind faith on the part of regional actors who refuse to accept the diktats of central government and who've convinced themselves that they can just brave it out by ignoring reality. The diminishing capacity factors in economic modelling set out by Transition Zero suggest that any new coal-driven projects implemented from now on in those regions will quite likely end up as stranded assets, as facilities become less and less able to service their debt requirements. Conversely, according to the research analysis, if China did accelerate its coal phase-out program, then a potential overall saving of no less than $1.6 trillion is up for grabs. And ironically, a large proportion of that would be in Inner Mongolia, as this colour-coded map shows. Dr. Duan's research team evaluated 9 different projection models of Chinese emissions running up to 2050 to get a range of reductions necessary to keep China on track for their net zero target. The resulting emissions chart is pretty complicated, and detailed analysis of all those assessment models is definitely outside the scope of this video, but we can see the range of projections for reductions in CO2, methane and nitrous oxide. It's a bit counterintuitive because the reductions are measured in percentage terms, so the more each line goes up, the higher the percentage reduction will be. And at the top end of the CO2 range, the line actually goes above 100%. In fact, it reaches 112% to be precise. And that means in addition to energy consumption reduction and fuel switching, it looks likely that on its current trajectory, the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter is going to have to employ so-called negative emissions technologies, or NETs. And that includes what the paper's authors call the formidable role of carbon capture and storage. In fact, the paper finds that carbon capture would have to account for, on average, 20% of total reductions in 2050. CCS is a widely quoted technology that allows most emissions projection models to show how the world might stay within the 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees warming targets. Trouble is, though, there are currently no examples of full-scale economically viable facilities anywhere in the world that are purely focused on capturing and permanently sequestering carbon dioxide without using it for any other purpose. CCS facilities do exist, though. In fact, according to this report, there are currently 26 operational commercial CCS facilities worldwide, ostensibly capturing 40 million tonnes of CO2 a year. That's about 0.1% of total annual human-induced CO2 emissions, by the way. 17 of those facilities came online since 2019, and 12 of those are in the United States, where a generous tax break known as 45Q allows oil companies to inject CO2 into depleted oil seams to release otherwise inaccessible fossil fuels, which then get burnt, releasing CO2 back into the atmosphere. Because the CO2 injected into those oil seams stays underground, the oil companies get to call it permanent carbon capture and storage, and win themselves a handsome subsidy in addition to the extra revenue they get from scraping out a bit more oil. Alternatively, and more likely in China's case, coal gasification or steam reforming of methane gas to make hydrogen can in theory be combined with carbon capture and storage. The commercial product of the process, though, is just hydrogen. The captured carbon dioxide is of no value at all if it's simply pumped underground forever. So without heavy incentives for compliance and penalties for non-compliance, coupled with very careful monitoring, it's easy to become slightly sceptical that best practice would always be followed, if you know what I mean. So in the face of all this fairly compelling data from two independent research papers, both of which arrive at remarkably similar conclusions, the insanity of opening new coal-fired power plants in China today is hard to ignore. The Transition Zero team have developed technology to measure coal plant output using satellite data and machine learning. All these variables are fed into constituent models, each of which uses its own specific method to compute a probability of what's known as asset vulnerability. The results from all four models are then combined to produce a final risk score, which can then be used to better inform divestment strategies for investors, plant retirement schedules by policymakers, environmental audits, and analysis for potential financial regulation. The proposal from the Transition Zero team is that China could adopt a version of this system to assess the viability of its existing coal fleet and make much better informed decisions that could accelerate their decarbonisation programme. Their assessment is that the carbon intensity of Chinese energy generation needs to drop from 672 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour today to 356 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour by 2030. And they reckon that by 2040, most coal generation will need to be closed, converted, or put into reserve capacity. It's certainly a big ask. Xi Jinping may be the supreme leader of his nation, but he's got exactly the same challenges as many other countries in cajoling and convincing state governments and very powerful fossil fuel industry people that change needs to happen very rapidly. The renewable energy industry is producing hardware at an eye-watering pace, and the economic advantages of wind and solar may well become unavoidable within the next few years, even for the most hard-nosed coal producers. One final caveat remains, though, that neither report mentions, but that can't in all conscience be ignored. A very recent investigation by the UK's Sheffield Hallam University alleges that forced labour of Uyghur Muslims is being deployed in Xinjiang province, where almost half of the world's polysilicon is produced for solar panels. That claim is denied by the Chinese government, of course, but it's a reminder that as the world accelerates the move away from fossil fuels, our leaders must be kept under pressure to ensure that alternative energy production methods are genuinely reducing overall carbon emissions, and that basic working conditions and human rights for industry employees are upheld wherever they are in the world. Otherwise, we'll be failing one of the United Nations key objectives, which is to achieve a just and fair transition of the workforce and the creation of decent work and quality jobs. Now, anytime I focus on China in one of my videos, there is always very understandable strength of feeling from many of you folks out there. So if you've got constructive and objective views that you'd like to share about China's transition to a more sustainable future, then jump down to the comment section below and leave your thoughts there. That's it for this week though. A big thank you to the folks who make these videos possible by supporting my work via Patreon. They allow me to remain completely independent, and they enable me to keep all my videos absolutely ad-free. And I must just give a quick shout out to those people who joined recently with pledges of $10 or more a month. They are Zach Orion Miller, Darren Campter, Wolf Dean Stiles, Richard Alsop, Bob Jackson, Jim Baker, Terry Richter, Skip Moss, Rick May, Stuart O'Neill, Jonathan Ross and Carlos Gonzalez. And of course a big thank you to everyone else who's joined since last time too. You can join the team at Patreon and get the opportunity to exchange ideas and information with like-minded folks, plus watch exclusive monthly news updates from me and have your say on future programmes in monthly content polls by visiting www.patreon.com/justhaveathink. And you can hugely support the channel absolutely for free by subscribing and hitting that like button and notification bell. Dead easy to do all that. You just need to click down there or on that icon there. As always, thanks very much for watching. Have a great week and remember to just have a think. See you next week.